Next, we have Yuri Watanabe. She is a doctoral candidate in English literature at Durham University. She's currently conducting research on the politics of sympathy in Victorian novels, focusing on the works of Elizabeth Gaskell, George Eliot, George Moore, and of course Thomas Hardy. Yuri completed her master's at the University of Tokyo in Japan, also on ideas of sympathy in Victorian fiction, but she wrote specifically on the Mayor of Casterbridge, Tess of the d'Urbervilles, and Jude the Obscure. It was through these master's studies that she became interested in how literature not only engages with society, but also actively shapes thinking and feeling, especially empathy. In particular, Yuri is fascinated by the ways in which Hardy challenges his readers to empathise with characters who are in some way flawed and rejected by society. And Yuri's paper today is called Sympathy in Distance, Fanny in Far From the Madding Crowd. Welcome, Yuri.
In the 1974 New Wessex edition of Far From the Madding Crowd, John Bailey tells us that the novel is central in every way. He is comparing it with Hardy's later novels, which he says give place to the darker and more demoralized picture. Meanwhile, Bailey is pleased with Far From the Madding Crowd in the way that we are wholly at home with Gabriel Oak and Bathsheba Everdeen. But I would like to pose a question today. Is Far From the Madding Crowd as centralized as Bailey thought? In particular, Bailey's point that the novel keeps away from demoralized themes, such as the fallen women, that is, women who lost their virginity outside marriage, which was an unforgivable sin in Victorian era, a subject Hardy will explicitly and radically represent only later in his writing. Terry Eagleton, he criticizes Bailey for repeating the gestures of Hardy's contemporary critics of wanting to read Hardy comfortably. Eagleton asserts that literature is the untidy refuge from an increasingly uniform and ideological world. How can we say that Far From the Madding Crowd is centralized unless we ignore Fanny Robin, the fallen woman character? It is true that she may only be a minor character, a plot device, and kept to the margins. But is she? Hardy neither makes her the heroine, nor uses her name in the title, nor states she is a pure woman, as he would later do in Tess of the d'Urbervilles. In fact, in much of the narration, the descriptions of Fanny are kept to a distant observer's point of view. Fanny is a stranger, and the narrator rarely mentions her by name. But in this presentation, I would like to explore how sympathy for Fanny Robin is an underlying presence in the novel. Moreover, how the form the narrator takes, the narrator treating her with some distance, is crucial to that sympathy, because it challenges readers to feel for a character with whom they lack personal intimate contact, to sympathize with a character with whom who is almost never mentioned by name, and who we are given very little psychological insight into. We commonly have this assumption that the more intimacy, the more we know about the other personally, the more understanding and more sympathy we feel for someone. Yet, more often in reality, we fail to have sympathy and connection because we fail the prerequisite to overcome the barrier between them and us. If this is so, through Far From the Madding Crowd, Hardy challenges readers if they can have sympathy for a fallen woman while still being barricaded by distance. So in this presentation, I will focus on 3 of the scenes in which Fanny appears to see how Hardy utilized his style of writing to evoke sympathy for Fanny. The first scene is Gabriel's encounter with Fanny in chapter 8. The second is Fanny's journey to Casterbridge in chapter 40. And finally, the scene in which Bathsheba finds Fanny in her coffin with the baby in chapter 43. Before we look at the first passage, I would like to talk briefly about how in Far From the Madding Crowd, seeing is a way of feeling and understanding. In The Profitable Reading of Fiction, Hardy concludes, quote, "Truly it has been observed that the eyes see that which brings with it the meaning of seeing." In other words, seeing is never an isolated activity of the eyes. What is seen is processed through the viewer's mind with its experiences, values, and cultures, and meaning is brought into what is seen. Hardy's writing style exhibits his interest into the visual perception and the ways of seeing. For example, looking at the opening scene of Far from the Madding Crowd, much of the presentation of Bathsheba is shown through the eyes of Gabriel Oak, with added emphasis by words such as beheld the sight, gazed, surveyed, looked, and observed. Bathsheba is presented in the framework of Gabriel's point of view, and from what he observes, Gabriel concludes that Bathsheba has her faults, that is, vanity. And in contrast to this rather straightforward opinion that Gabriel forms through his observation of Bathsheba, the majority of the novel, however, shows how seeing and understanding are filled with misperception, misunderstanding, and different, even conflicting ways of seeing. For example, many of the main characters choose actions depending on what they see, but on many of those occasions, the characters are blinded by love or cannot see clearly. Critics such as J.B. Bullen and Stephen Regan have noted how, in Far from the Madding Crowd, many major events happen at night when light is scarce and the character's vision is physically blocked. And Regan writes, so many crucial scenes, including decisive moments of judgment and confrontation, take place at night or in the half-light, when clear vision is difficult to obtain. Such scenes include Boldwood looking at the Valentine card on his mantelpiece and Bathsheba's first encounter with Troy. So it is not surprising, then, that Fanny Robin makes her first appearance in the dark. Fanny, although readers do not know her yet, is secretly traveling to see her lover Troy to ask if he is willing to keep his promise of marrying her. Gabriel meets her by chance, and although he doesn't know any details about her, senses that she is in need of help and offers her a shilling, which she gratefully accepts. In the night gloom, Gabriel's hand brushes upon Fanny's hand, and he feels it. To quote from the book, "In feeling for each other's palm in the gloom before the money could be passed, a minute incident occurred which told much. Gabriel's fingers alighted on the young woman's wrist. It was beating with a throb of tragic intensity." A young woman traveling alone would have likely raised the suspicions of Hardy's conservative readers who upheld strict Victorian morals of female sexual purity. Fanny also notices Gabriel's gaze on his bundle and uncomfortably asks him to keep her a secret. We would expect Fanny, the fallen woman, to be most prejudiced against and misunderstood by all the characters by Victorian readers, even before they pick up the novel or the Cornhill magazine. They would bring judgmental meaning into their seeing. So it does not make sense that in this scene, Fanny is perceived with such precision, that throb of tragic intensity. Hardy maneuvers around the problems of misperception by demonstrating how adequate light is not required for Gabriel to recognize Fanny's plight. So Gabriel exemplifies the ability to sympathize without intimate knowledge of the other. He does not know Fanny, who she is, or where she is coming from and where she is going. Yet in that brief encounter, he felt himself in the penumbra of a very deep sadness when touching that slight and fragile creature. There is a social distance between the two, but they are in physical proximity to each other, so close that they touch, and Gabriel can catch her shivering in the dark. The understanding that comes with just being right beside the person shakes off the rational thoughts and opinions one may have already formed against the other. When one is close by, the response becomes instinctive, without forethought. This initial meeting between Gabriel and Fanny is foundational for her coming appearances. The next time a penumbra appears is 8 months later in chapter 40, when Fanny, pregnant with Troy's child, walks to Casterbridge Workhouse. So this chapter has often been compared, both by modern critics and contemporary reviews, to one in George Eliot's novel Adam Bede. In a famous chapter called Journey in Despair, Hetty Sorrel travels back from her failed attempt to see her lover Arthur Donnithorne, who abandons her and whose child she bears. There are significant similarities in the way Hardy and Eliot create the scene. For example, the way the women clutch rails as a way of showing the painstakingly difficult and slow walk towards a destination. So in Adam Bede, George Eliot writes, She reached the opposite gate and felt her way along its rails, the rails of the sheepfold, till her hand encountered the prickly of the gorsy wall. Delicious sensation. She had found shelter. Hetty sank down on the straw with a sense of escape. Compared with Far from the Madding Crowd, where Hardy writes, "Less than a mile," the women murmured. "No more," she added after a pause. "The mile to the country hall, and my resting place is on the other side of Casterbridge, a little over a mile, and there I am." And skipping. Holding to the rail, she advanced, thrusting one hand forward upon the rail, and then the other, then leaning over it whilst she dragged her feet on beneath. As we can see, the comparison accentuates the lack of character inner insight in Hardy's writing, while George Eliot employs words such as prickling to engage a sense of touch, or emphasizes how Hetty's hand encountered the wall and uses free indirect thought, delicious sensation, all to effectively produce heightened and intense motion, and the reader's share in what Hetty is feeling. Meanwhile, Hardy sticks to observing Fanny's thoughts only as she says them aloud, and his use of thrusting and leaning, in comparison to Hetty feeling and encountering, creates a rather dry description, limited to what is visual. Moreover, Fanny is only referred to as the woman, never by her name. For the entire chapter, Fanny is only referred to as the woman, the crouching woman, the pedestrian, the wayfarer, the girl, the sick and weary woman, the suffering woman, the prostrate figure, the overcome traveler, and the small and supple one. Despite this style of writing, however, according to Lawrence Jones, Eliot remains at heart uncompromisingly judgmental towards the characters. In the end, Hetty Sorrel is judged as an egoist. On the other hand, Jones writes, "The pathos of Fanny is quite a simple effect compared to that. A much slenderer character, she is chiefly presented as a victim, an object of sympathy rather than of our judgment." So then, where does this unjudgmental sympathy come from? Despite taking an overall writing style that seems aloof and distanced, Hardy works in subtle ways, inserting brief moments of insight into Fanny's point of view, brief and casual, yet very meaningful, in the way that reminds us of how Gabriel accidentally brushed against Fanny's hand. Coincidentally, this next passage also has to do with the touch of the hand. She became conscious of something touching her hand. It was softness, and it was warmth. She opened her eyes, and the substance touched her face. A dog was licking her cheek. Right before this passage, the observant narrator, and therefore the reader, has noticed a shadow detaching itself and gliding towards Fanny. If this were told from the observer's point of view, the reader would have been told that it was a dog approaching Fanny. But the focalizer has changed here. Because it is now from Fanny's limited point of view, she had closed her eyes in fatigue. She first feels the presence of the furry animal before understanding that it is a dog. Such a writing technique that utilizes a narrative gap between description and understanding has been skillfully explained by Ian Watt in his discussion of Conrad's novel, The Heart of Darkness. Watt picks out the dramatic scene in which Marlowe's boat is attacked. In the scene, the first-person narrative says, "Sticks, little sticks are flying about, thick." And only later does the narrator exclaim, "Arrows, by Jove, we are being shot at." Watt, coining the term delay decoding, explains it is a technique in which is the verbal equivalent to an impressionist painter's attempt to directly render visual sensation. It presents the protagonist's immediate sensations and thus makes the reader aware of the gap between the event and the observer's trailing understanding of it. And in by doing so, it enacts the disjunction between the character's mind and how he processes it. In the same way, Hardy dramatizes Fanny's thought process as she is greeted by the dog, and in this way, readers find themselves placed very close to Fanny's point of view. Although the chapter may not mention Fanny's name once, the narrator and therefore the reader touch upon Fanny's inner feelings and connect with her in a very deep and sympathetical way. The last scene we will discuss was not published in the Cornhill serialization. Leslie Stephen, the editor, requested Hardy to leave out the disturbing description of Fanny and her baby lying in the coffin, and to treat Fanny's seduction in a gingerly fashion. Hardy had described the baby as A miniature wrapping in white linen, a face so delicately small in contour and substance that its cheeks and the plump back of its little fists irresistibly reminded her, excited as she was, of the soft convexity of mushrooms on a dewy morning. Perhaps Hardy had gone so far for the Gothic effects that even modern readers, a century and a half later, may still wonder whether this is morally acceptable. We are shaken and troubled by this image of a dead child's hands eerily portrayed as mushrooms on a dewy morning. Aesthetic standards change over time, and towards the end of the 19th century and entering the 20th, the shift could not be more evident in the emergence of decadence, naturalism, and modernism. As Regan states, the episode also contains stylistic flourishes which even now seem calculatedly perverse, as if challenging conventional moral and aesthetic ideals through the triumphant display of bad taste. Hardy clearly had a different agenda from his contemporaries when it came to morality. Aesthetic was not about creating what is beautiful and pleasing. Aesthetic is concerned with what kind of sensation is aroused with a view. So what effect does bad taste have on our reception? Vanessa Ryan explores the ways in which new emerging Victorian concepts in physiology and psychology influence readers of sensation novels to create the most nervous shock possible. Unconscious cerebration was a term coined by William Carpenter to explain the operation of the mind when the governing will was suspended. Bathsheba, when with eager eyes peers into the coffin, dreading what she will find inside, confirms that there was a child, and despite her agitation, is irresistibly reminded of mushrooms by the baby's small, plump fists. The description next moves on to the mother, Fanny. Fanny was framed in by that golden hair of hers. She appeared rounder in feature and much younger, and her hands had required a preternatural refinement. The passage continues. The youth and fairness of both the silent ones withdrew from the scene all association of a repulsive kind, even every unpleasant ray. And skipping down, they struck upon the sense and the aspect of incipiency, not that of decadence. This is a deeply singular perception of Fanny and her baby, one that deliberately views them as withdrawn from all association of the repulsive kind, standing upon a new stage of existence. This is Hardy presenting his readers with a view of Fanny in her incipiency, without her history, scandal, shame, or condemnation, just a raw, vivid, and intuitive perception of her. The disturbing effect the Gothic has upon the readers is that it so shakes the nerves of the readers that it also shakes away any pre-thoughts, prejudice, biases, conventions, and judgmental morals that may tint the lenses of the readers. We should also notice how significant it is that here in this chapter the narrator finally uses the name Fanny, either because it is Bathsheba's point of view or because the narrator is liberated from his role as a distant observer, because the distance between Bathsheba and Fanny and between the reader and Fanny have been overcome. So in conclusion, we have seen the ways in which Far From the Madding Crowd shows sympathy for Fanny, despite a distant style of writing, both in the briefness of her appearances and the minimal features. This is radical because Hardy demonstrates how we can sympathize with the others, despite there being a barricade between us. He shows how physical and metaphorical contact and responding instinctively can melt away prejudices and biases. Such an attitude can be summed up as this. Oak showed the mastery of every turn and look he gave, among the multitude of interests by which he was surrounded. Those which affected his personal well-being were not the most absorbing and important in his eyes. Oak meditatively looked upon the horizon of circumstances without any special regard to his own standpoint in the midst. That was how she would wish to be. As a final note, I would like to ask how reading a deep and underlying sympathy for Fanny might change the way we read Far From the Madding Crowd as a whole. I began by saying, unlike Tess, Fanny's name is not in the title. Far From the Madding Crowd, as we know, is a line taken from Thomas Gray's poem, Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard. But in the novel, Who is a character who for 8 months walked far away from the rest of the action and in the end is buried in Weatherbury churchyard? Perhaps the title can be attributed to the character with whom lies the most distance, but she, in fact, should not be forgotten. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yuri.